Is the UN Security Council's inability to resolve Syria's crisis a signal of its growing irrelevance? Is the UN Security Council's inability to resolve Syria's crisis a signal of its growing irrelevance? Speaker 327 will be questioned by number 264.
Hello Kitty is an animated cartoon character that can't even talk. Yet somehow she, or it, depending on your perspective, is doing more for Syria than any other diplomat. There is so much demand for Hello Kitty merchandise that Syrian factories in Aleppo are producing 24 hours a day, maintaining a crucial economic lifeline to a war-torn city. This is a cause of embarrassment to other international players. But as the New York Times pointed out on June 11th of this year, despite conclusive evidence that Syria has used chemical weapons against its own people, the United Nations Security Council, consisting of the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, and China, has not yet reached a joint position on how the conflict should be resolved. But in his book, The Emergency State, David Unger contends that the Security Council was a product of the Cold War, but did not have the preparedness for the current crisis in the Middle East, meaning that the Security Council, instead of finding a solution, could be preventing one, prompting us to ask ourselves a crucial question. Is the UN Security Council's inability to resolve Syria's crisis a signal of its growing irrelevance? The answer is a definitive no for three key reasons. First, because the United Nations Security Council is demonstrating its best feature, dialogue. Second, because the Security Council is maintaining its commitment to peace. And third and finally, because the Security Council is responding cautiously to a complex situation. The UNSC has one feature that Hello Kitty doesn't, the ability to create dialogue. And this is absolutely essential. In his book, The Fog of Law, Michael J. Glennon contends that the world desperately needs one institution where the world's greatest military powers can have regular discussions on the world's most crucial military matters. This is why the Security Council is relevant, because other organizations, such as NATO and the Group of Eight, have different purposes and even different commitments. But the United Nations Security Council is demonstrating the effectiveness of dialogue. The Center for American Progress contends on June 13th of this year that as the situation in Syria has been devolving for over 2 years, the Security Council has been the only forum where the world's foremost powers can actually articulate their true positions on the Syrian crisis. Furthermore, all of this dialogue in the Security Council is actually preventing an overreaction or escalation in Syria. As the Foreign Policy Research Institute contended in May of this year, as Russia and China have growing military and economic might, the world has more need than ever to truly understand their military posture, especially in regard to Syria. Because the United Nations Security Council is demonstrating this crucial dialogue, and because it is preventing escalation in Syria, this inability to resolve the Syrian crisis does not reflect growing irrelevance. Hello Kitty isn't the only toy present in Syria. In a recent YouTube video posted by Syrian rebels, they were brandishing very intimidating guns, until one commenter pointed out that the guns were toys. But although these toys are leading to peace, the United Nations Security Council is also maintaining its commitment to peace. The Heritage Foundation pointed out on April 27th of this year that unlike NATO, the chief position of the United Nations Security Council is to use military strategizing to preserve security and peace. And in Syria, just because the United Nations isn't responding doesn't mean it isn't relevant. As the Center for Strategic International Studies pointed out on June 3rd of this year, that in Syria, because of all the growing escalations from places like the opposition, as well as the Syrian regime itself, the United Nations Security Council must prevent an escalation. For example, if it places an arms embargo on Syria, the regime will only be emboldened and increase its brutality. Whereas if the United Nations Security Council supports the rebels, then there's chances that it could support extremism. But Michael Doran, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute, contended on June 11th of this year that despite Russia's shipment of missile defense to Syria, the opposition and the regime are reaching a stalemate, meaning that they'd be in a better position than ever to reach peace and a finality to the conflict. As a result, the inaction of the United Nations Security Council did not lead to crisis or irrelevance, but rather it led to peace, a sign of enduring relevance. But as the situation in Syria continues to injure and maim thousands of people, the United Nations Security Council must be aware of its strategic tools. The Heritage Foundation pointed out on June 9th of this year that just because the United Nations Security Council has not taken a decisive action in Syria doesn't mean it still has unique military tools. As the Chatham House noted on May 23rd of this year, the situation in Syria involves 1.5 million refugees, armed terrorist groups such as Hezbollah, and now opposition forces that are linked to Al-Qaeda. But as the Syrian situation gravitates increasingly towards a humanitarian and sectarian conflict, the United Nations Security Council still has the best array of tools. As the Council on Foreign Relations noted on June 3rd of this year, that because the United Nations Security Council has a unique ability to consult with the United Nations Human Rights Council, as well as the Arab League, it is in a better position than any other organization in the world to broker a peaceful solution to the situation in Syria. So because the United Nations Security Council is responding cautiously and maintaining its unique and unparalleled military tools, we can see that its inability to resolve Syria's crisis is not a reflection of its growing irrelevance. So, with the United Nations Security Council in a time of crisis, we asked ourselves a crucial question as to whether the UN Security Council's inability to resolve Syria's crisis was a signal of its growing irrelevance. We saw that it was not. First, because increasingly, the UN Security Council is demonstrating its best feature, dialogue. Second, because the Security Council is maintaining its commitment to peace. And third and finally, because the United Nations Security Council is responding cautiously to a complex solution that can still be resolved. So, while the United Nations Security Council may have some serious strategizing to do, Hello Kitty, toy guns, and a variety of the toy chest is still willing to help. But regardless of what the UNSC actually does, it's up to that organization to signal that playtime is over.
Speech. To begin, you speak of how the United Nations is so great on dialogue, but since Russia will no longer sit down with the United States or any other country, how is the United Nations not completely irrelevant when it comes to dialogue in general?
Well, the United Nations Security Council is a place where each nation can voice its displeasure or agreement with UNSC resolutions. Because nations are continually proposing actions, they can measure the response from nations like Russia and China to determine what their true posture is. In other organizations such as the G8, there are only bilateral discussions between players like Russia and the United States. But the UNSC is the only place where the world's 5 foremost military powers have a definitive knowledge of what every single other actor desires.
Because the United Nations took such a slow response to the genocide in Rwanda and ultimately regretted it, why is there any evidence to believe that the 100,000 dead in Syria doesn't warrant some sort of action from the Security Council?
Because as I pointed out, Syria is such a complex situation where any action by the Security Council could provoke an overreaction, or worse, an escalation. The UNSC is risking even more deaths if it takes a hasty response. But because it is taking a measured and cautious approach, and because the forces in Syria are reaching a stalemate, it is reaching a perfect position where it can intervene and find a peaceable way to broker a transition rather than a civil war or a sectarian conflict.
How many times has the United Nations during the Arab Spring been able to have any kind of successful negotiations between Syrian rebels and the Syrian government?
Well, the United Nations has been trying repeatedly. Initially, there was a set conference in June in Geneva between Bashar al-Assad and the rebel forces. But this is being increasingly complicated by other nations, such as the United States, who announced that they will arm the rebels. When these other actors begin complicating UN efforts, this takes a response from the Syrian forces. If there's an arms embargo, the regime is only emboldened. But if arms are provided to the rebels, then the regime has no choice but to respond with even more force. Great speech. Your first point regarding the inequality of women in South Africa, is this more of a problem created by the government or by societal attitudes within the nation?
It's actually largely created by both, but the government does nothing to stop the social attitudes. It tried to put in place these parliamentarians, but it does nothing with the political parties, like the ANC who control the government, to give them freedom. Also, the fact that police don't respond to calls by women is a clear governmental problem.
You continually imply that the government is perpetuating this inequality. What specifically is the government doing to ensure that this inequality remains?
Okay, well, the government does two things. First, many of the leaders within the African National Congress, the party who's ruled South Africa since the end of apartheid, are extremely corrupt. Thus, they're not giving money to social programs. Second, police officers are extremely corrupt, often cracking down on the disadvantaged.
Okay, so with the situation in South Africa, both a governmental and societal problem, what exactly can be done to resolve the issue of inequality?
Okay, well, the first thing that needs to happen is crack down on this police and governmental corruption. While societal problems take a lot longer to solve, there need to be strong governmental institutions that are helping move the society in the right direction.
And then in the final point regarding economic equality, much of the mines you mentioned were foreign operated. How would foreign companies investing in South Africa contribute to economic inequality?
Well, the problem is actually the South African government's problem in that they allow the corporations to control these towns and essentially become the governments in any areas of South Africa. The government should allow those companies not to do that, and then the companies would be more responsible. They're taking advantage of an opportunity.
But more government action in South Africa will scare away many of these multinationals. And what implications does that have for economic growth and equality?
It actually won't. They're more scared right now because there's these huge protests that have cut the ability of the platinum and gold mines to operate. If the government can ensure societal stability, even if it makes it a little bit more expensive, they'll stay because there's so many resources.